In the vast theater of war, where every decision carries the weight of life and death, where each moment shapes the fate of thousands, there are stories that rise like whispers from forgotten battlefield, stories that defy logic and rewrite destiny. One of these stories begins on a cold morning when exhaustion and chaos pushed a soldier to make an unbelievable mistake, a mistake that somehow changed everything and saved more lives than anyone could have imagined. The world was burning, armies clashed across shattered cities, and the sky roared with the thunder of metal as nations fought desperately for control. In the middle of this storm stood a young communications operator named Adrian, a quiet man whose duty was simple: to transmit messages from headquarters to the frontline commanders. Adrian never imagined that his role would influence history, but fate has its own way of choosing heroes, and sometimes it chooses them through accidents, not intentions. Adrian was stationed inside a small bunker hidden beneath a forest. The bunker trembled day and night from distant artillery, but it remained one of the few lines of communication still intact after a series of attacks. Supply routes were broken, troops were scattered, and commanders were desperate for instructions. Tension hung thick like smoke, and every operator knew that a single mistake could doom thousands. On the eastern ridge, a battalion of soldiers awaited orders. The enemy was advancing with overwhelming force. Rumors spread that they carried heavy armor and reinforcements. If the battalion made the wrong move, they would be crushed within minutes. Yet, if they withdrew too soon, the enemy would push through the valley and reach a nearby town where thousands of civilians were taking shelter. The situation demanded perfect timing and precise orders, and those orders now depended on Adrian. In the bunker, Adrian received a coded message from headquarters instructing the battalion to prepare for a tactical retreat, but the system had been damaged. Wires were exposed, radios hissed with static, and the stress of non-stop transmissions had drained Adrian completely, but he worked relentlessly, determined to keep the line alive for those relying on him. Then it happened. The mistake that no operator should ever make, a slip of the hand, caused Adrian to transmit an incorrect coordinate to the battalion. Instead of instructing them to retreat toward the south valley, he accidentally directed them toward a narrow mountain pass, a place that was never meant to be part of the plan. When the commander on the ridge received the message, confusion surged through the ranks. The pass was dangerous, filled with sharp turns and steep cliffs. Even worse, it appeared to lead directly toward enemy territory. Still, the message seemed official, and under the weight of uncertainty, the commander chose to follow it, believing headquarters had a larger plan that he was not fully aware of. The battalion moved through the pass with caution, expecting ambush, expecting annihilation, expecting a hopeless end. But reality was about to reveal a shocking truth. What no one knew, not the commander, not headquarters, not even Adrian, was that the enemy had planned a massive encirclement. The enemy intended to trap the battalion on the Southern Valley path, the very path they were supposed to take according to the correct original message. The enemy had studied the terrain for weeks. They positioned artillery along the Southern Valley. They prepared infantry in hidden trenches, and at the perfect moment they would crush the battalion completely, leaving no survivors. The civilians in the town would then be at the mercy of the advancing force. The fate of thousands hung by a single thread, and that thread was tied to a mistake. As the battalion moved through the mountain pass, something unexpected happened. The pass curved around the ridge and led them behind the enemy lines, not into danger but into an undefended gap. The enemy never expected anyone to approach from there. The terrain was rugged and nearly impossible for vehicles, but the battalion was light and mobile, able to move quietly through the rocky slopes while the enemy forces waited on the Southern Valley. Believing their trap was perfect, the battalion emerged behind them as the sun rose, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The commander realized the unimaginable. They had appeared in the one position the enemy had left unguarded. The battalion acted quickly, cutting off communication lines, disabling artillery, and disrupting the entire enemy formation. Chaos erupted in the enemy camp. Their perfect strategy collapsed instantly. They were forced to retreat, abandoning their plan completely. The civilians in the nearby town were saved. The enemy advance was halted, and the battalion that was supposed to be destroyed became the reason. Thousands survived, all because of a single mistake made by a tired operator in a dark bunker. When Adrian learned what happened, he was certain he would be punished, maybe even court-martialed. He expected the worst. Instead, he was met with silence, not anger, not punishment, only deep, thoughtful silence from the officers. The truth spread quietly through the ranks that his mistake had saved the battalion. While no official record would highlight his error, whispers of the unbelievable event moved like secret smoke from camp to camp. Soldiers spoke of the operator who made the wrong transmission at the right moment, while commanders privately debated whether fate had intervened or whether chaos itself had chosen to spare them. Adrian never considered himself a hero. He simply felt the weight of his mistake pressing on his chest like a burden too heavy to bear. But when he later heard that the civilians in the valley survived, families, children, elders, entire households spared because of the battalion unexpected movement, he felt something inside him shift, a realization that sometimes in war perfection is not what saves lives. Sometimes survival is born from moments that should never have happened, moments that break the rules of strategy, moments that rewrite destiny. As time went on, the story faded from official reports, erased by commanders who could never admit that a mistake changed everything. But among the soldiers who lived through that day, the memory stayed alive, a reminder that the battlefield is unpredictable and that even flawed decisions can create miracles. Adrian returned home after the war, never knowing the full extent of the lives he saved, but in quiet corners of the world families thrived and children grew into adults, all because one man made the most unbelievable mistake at the most critical moment. And that is the strange truth hidden beneath the surface of history, that sometimes the wrong message becomes the right path, sometimes the error becomes the miracle, sometimes the moment that should have destroyed you becomes the moment that saves thousands. And sometimes fate chooses its heroes in ways no one could ever expect. No strategy, no perfection, only a single human mistake that forever changed the future. The story of that day grew into something almost mythical, whispered by soldiers around campfires and passed down quietly through generations. They would tell how destiny can shift in the blink of an eye, how a tired man in a bunker unknowingly reshaped the future. The battalion that survived carried the memory like an invisible medal. They never forgot that they walked through death without realizing it, that they escaped a trap that should have ended them, that they rescued thousands of innocent civilians, not because of strategy, not because of superior firepower, but because a single message was sent incorrectly and yet correctly for the hand of fate. The commander who had led his men through the mountain pass often thought back to that moment. He would stare at maps, trying to understand how the mistake aligned so perfectly with the one hidden weakness in the enemy strategy. He had been trained to rely on logic and precise planning, but on that day logic would have led them into disaster. Only uncertainty, only confusion, only the flawed message saved them. As the years passed and the war ended, many forgot the countless battles fought in dust and fire, but some memories carved themselves into the minds of those who lived through them, and among those memories, the strange tale of the mistake that saved thousands remained powerful. The civilians in the valley rebuilt their homes, rebuilt their lives. Children ran through rebuilt streets, unaware that they had once stood on the edge of destruction, unaware of the narrow thread that had held their fate, a thread tied to a misstep, an error that no one celebrated publicly, but that everyone who knew quietly respected. The truth of war is that history is not only shaped by grand victories and deliberate intelligence operations. Sometimes history is shaped by the trembling hand of a man pushed beyond his limits, the weary mind, the exhausted heart. Adrian never sought recognition, and he never received it. He returned to his small village, where he lived a quiet life, working simple jobs and keeping mostly to himself. Occasionally, he would hear travelers speak of the war stories spreading across the land, and every time he heard whispers about the battalion that escaped a perfect ambush, he felt a weight in his chest, knowing he was the unseen ghost behind that miracle. He never told anyone, not his family, not his neighbors, not even his closest friends. He did not want praise and he did not want blame. He believed that if people knew, they would see him differently, either as a lucky hero or a reckless fool, and he wanted neither. He wanted peace, nothing more. Decades passed, and the world changed. The cities rebuilt, new nations rose, and alliances shifted, but some truths linger in the air like echoes from forgotten mountains. One day, a young historian visited the region, collecting oral testimonies from surviving veterans. She had heard faint stories about a mysterious miscommunication that altered the outcome of a critical moment, and she wanted to uncover the truth. The historian eventually found one of the old soldiers from the battalion. The retired commander, now aged and frail, smiled thoughtfully when she mentioned the event. He told her that many official documents avoided the story because none of the officers wanted to admit how dangerously close they had come to disaster. He said that the mountain pass felt like walking through the breath of death, that the slightest mistake could have ended them, yet somehow they had been guided into salvation. When she asked who sent the incorrect message, he paused and closed his eyes as if traveling back in time. He said quietly that the identity of the operator was never revealed, but he believed the man must have carried a heavy burden, thinking he had doomed them rather than saved them. The historian took these words and began searching further. She traced communications records, she interviewed families of old officers, she searched logs that had been half destroyed over the decades, and after months of uncovering scattered clues, she finally discovered the name Adrian. She traveled to the small village where he lived, but by then Adrian had grown old, his hair white, his hands trembling, yet his eyes still held the depth of a man who had seen the world at its darkest. She approached him gently, asking if he had served in the communications bunker. Adrian nodded quietly. She asked if he remembered the day of the incorrect transmission. For a moment Adrian said nothing. The air grew still, as if the entire room held its breath. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Only a few words. He remembered everything, but he also believed that some stories were not meant to be claimed, some victories not meant to be owned. He told her that he did what he thought was his duty, and nothing more, that whatever happened afterward was beyond his intention. The historian felt the weight of his humility. She realized that this man did not want glory, he simply wanted the truth to rest quietly, without being twisted into legend. She promised him that if she ever wrote of the event, she would focus not on heroic exaggeration, but on the fragile reality that shaped it, the reality that a single exhausted human moment can alter destiny. Adrian nodded, grateful. As she prepared to leave, he asked her to remember one message. He said that the world often celebrates perfection, but sometimes it is human imperfection that protects humanity. The historian carried his words with her long after she left the village. She wrote about the event with care, describing the fragile lines of fate, the unpredictable nature of war, and the quiet miracle shaped by a mistake. Her book became a powerful reflection of how humans stumble through history, how intentions and outcomes do not always follow the same path, how sometimes the wrong turn becomes the only road to survival. Through her writing, the story reached thousands of readers, people who realized for the first time how delicate the line of fate can be. Adrian lived the last years of his life simply tending his garden, watching seasons change, and carrying the memory of the mistake that once haunted him. But as time softened the edges of the past, he came to understand something profound, that perhaps the mistake was never a mistake. Perhaps it was the universe shifting the path in a way no human could see, guiding the battalion away from death, guiding civilians toward safety, guiding history toward a different tomorrow. When Adrian passed away, he left behind no medals, no records, no grand monuments, only a quiet legacy known by those who sought the truth, a legacy that taught that the world does not always move in straight lines, and that sometimes destinies are rewritten by the most unlikely hands. Soldiers who survived the ambush trap would later tell their children that life can change because of moments that seem accidental, unpredictable, unplanned, and that sometimes heroes are not the ones who charge into battle, but the ones who make choices without understanding their future consequences. In time, the story transformed into a reminder for generations that every decision matters, even the smallest, even the unintentional, and that life is shaped not only by brilliance but also by human fragility. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered across the old mountain pass where the battalion once walked, survivors would say they could almost hear the echoes of that miraculous day, the footsteps that should have been their last, the silence of a trap waiting to spring, and the invisible hand of destiny guiding them safely through a mistake that saved thousands, a mistake that changed everything forever. As the years turned into decades, the mountain pass where the battalion had marched slowly became a forgotten trail covered with moss and drifting leaves. Few people traveled through it, and fewer still knew the weight of what had once happened there. Yet the land remembered, the wind remembered, the earth remembered the steps of men who walked unknowingly between life and death, guided by a message that was never meant for them, guided by an error that had become their shield. In another part of the world, the old commander lived out his final years in a quiet home surrounded by books and fading maps. He often sat by the window with the afternoon sun warming his face, and he would close his eyes, remembering the faces of the soldiers who survived because of that mistake. He remembered the young recruits who had laughed nervously as they moved through the narrow pass, the steady footsteps of veterans who understood the seriousness of every inch of ground they covered, and the eerie feeling of walking into a place where no enemy waited despite the expectation of danger. He kept a small notebook on his desk filled with memories from the war, not official records, not tactical analysis, but moments that touched him deeply, moments that shaped him. One entry described the night after they emerged from behind the enemy lines. He wrote that the air felt electric with disbelief, that the soldiers spoke in hushed tones, unable to understand how they were still alive, that even the toughest among them sat in silence, staring at the ground, wondering what invisible force had steered them away from death. He wrote that at first he felt confusion, then suspicion, then a strange, overwhelming gratitude, because he realized that survival does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from destiny bending in unexpected directions, sometimes from mistakes. He kept this notebook hidden, never sharing it with anyone, because he believed the story was too delicate, too sacred to be turned into political speeches or military lectures. He did not want it used as propaganda. He wanted it preserved as a truth of human vulnerability. And Chance, the historian who had spoken with Adrian, eventually found the old commander, and she asked him why he never reported the true story officially. He smiled gently and told her that war is full of stories that do not fit neatly into official narrative, stories that reveal the limits of human control, stories that remind us that even the most powerful armies depend on moments beyond strategy. He said that revealing the dependence on a mistake might have embarrassed commanders or undermined the illusion of absolute control, but he believed the deeper truth mattered more, that sometimes chaos protects as much as it destroys. The historian traveled again to the mountain pass, determined to walk the same ground the battalion walked. She took careful steps along the narrow, rocky path, feeling the wind brush against her face, the same wind that must have touched the soldiers decades before. As she moved higher, she imagined the weight of their gear, the uncertainty in their hearts, the steady determination that carried them forward. She pictured the enemy waiting in the valley below, completely unaware that the battalion had slipped through their trap. She realized how impossible it would have been for commanders to intentionally plan such a route, how unlikely it was that anyone would choose a narrow, dangerous climb over an open valley. Yet the valley had been the path of destruction, while the impossible pass had become the gateway to life. She understood then that the story was not only about war, but about the unpredictable nature of existence, that sometimes the safest place lies through the most unlikely door, that sometimes the correct path appears wrong and the wrong path becomes the miracle. She reached the end of the pass and gazed out over the landscape, imagining the battalion emerging at dawn, seeing the enemy camp below, completely unprepared, seeing the opportunity that appeared like a gift from destiny. Her heart pounded as she felt the weight of what had happened here, the fragile line between life and death, drawn by a single mistaken message. She sat quietly, letting the memory of the place speak to her, and she felt connected to Adrian, the operator, who had lived with the burden for so long. She wished he could have walked the pass with her, to see with his own eyes that his mistake had not been a burden but a blessing, a silent act of fate woven into the world itself. Across the nearby valley, families continued their lives, their villages filled with the laughter of children who had never known how close their ancestors came to destruction. Every generation carried invisible stories inside them, stories shaped by events they never witnessed and perhaps never even knew existed, but the truth remained that they lived because of a moment that defied logic, a moment born from exhaustion, a moment that turned fear into deliverance. Years later, the historian published a second work, a deeper, more reflective book that explored the nature of human error and destiny. She wrote that the event was not simply a wartime anecdote, but a reminder of the mysterious forces that shape the world. She argued that mistakes are often judged harshly, but sometimes they hold unexpected meaning, that humans try to control everything, but life slips through those controls in ways both terrifying and beautiful. Her book became widely read, and many people found comfort in its message, especially those who carried guilt from their own mistakes. She received letters from soldiers, from nurses, from teachers, from parents, each sharing stories of moments when a mistake changed their lives, some for worse, but some for better. People began to understand that imperfection is not always failure, that sometimes it is part of a larger, unseen pattern. One day, a group of students traveled to the mountain pass. Inspired by the historian's work, they carried simple, handmade flags, not of nations or armies, but of peace and remembrance. They walked the path slowly, imagining the weight of history beneath their feet. When they reached the highest ridge, they placed the flags gently into the ground, letting them flutter in the wind. Each flag symbolized a life saved. Each flag honored an unknown hero. Each flag whispered the same silent truth, that the world is shaped by forces beyond perfect plans, shaped by human minds, shaped by human errors, shaped by fragile Unpredictable moments they stood with their hands on their hearts, not in military salute, but in quiet respect for the man in the bunker, the soldiers who followed the impossible path, and the civilians whose lives blossomed because of that day. Far from the past, far from the war, Adrian legacy lived on, not through medals or monuments, but through the lives of countless people who never knew his name but lived because his tired hands slipped on a radio dial. The story of his mistake spread slowly through the world, carried by those who believe that truth matters, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is strange, even when it challenges the myth of perfect control. In small classrooms, teachers shared the story to remind children that mistakes do not always define failure, that sometimes their consequences travel farther than anyone expects. In training academies, young officers studied the event not as a blueprint for strategy, but as a lesson in humility, a lesson that even the best plans can crumble, and even the most unlikely paths can save lives. Musicians created songs about the unseen heroes of history. Artists painted scenes of the narrow pass. Writers crafted poems about the invisible hands that guide fate in ways humans rarely understand. And so the legacy expanded quietly, gently, beautifully, without fanfare, without speeches, without ceremonies, just as Adrian would have wanted, because his story was not about glory, it was about humanity, imperfect, fragile, unpredictable humanity. And the world that humanity builds day by day, moment by moment, mistake by mistake, miracle by miracle. In the twilight of his life, Adrian often sat under the old tree beside his small house, listening to the rustling leaves above him. The gentle shifting sound reminded him of radio static, soft and unpredictable, like the memories that drifted through his mind. He wondered sometimes how different the world might have been if he had not made that mistake, if his tired hands had not slipped, if he had transmitted the correct message. He imagined the battalion marching straight into the valley, unaware of the trap waiting for them. He imagined their destruction, the echo of artillery, the cries, the smoke rising into the sky. He imagined the civilians in the town hearing the dreadful news, knowing the enemy would soon reach them. He imagined lives ending, dreams shattering, families disappearing into the shadow of war. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, grateful that the world had not taken that path, grateful that fate had guided him in a direction he never intended. Even in his quiet solitude, he never felt like a hero. He simply felt like a man who had been caught in the storm of events far larger than himself, a man who made a single human mistake that somehow aligned with the mysterious currents of destiny. The historian visited him once more before writing her final work. She traveled again to the small village, walking up the familiar path toward his home. She saw him sitting under the tree, his hands resting calmly on his lap. The years had softened him, but his eyes still held that quiet depth. When she approached, he greeted her with a small, gentle smile. She told him that her new book would focus not on war, but on human nature, on the fragile threads that connect people across time. She said she wanted to use his story to show the power of humility, the unpredictable beauty of imperfection, and the hidden meaning inside moments humans often overlook. He listened quietly, then nodded, and told her she may write whatever truth she believed needed to be told. After all, he said, stories are not owned by those who live them, they are carried by those who learn from them. His words resonated with her deeply. They reminded her why she had begun studying history in the first place, not for records, not for dates, not for official accounts, but for the human hearts beating beneath those accounts, the hearts that felt fear, hope, regret, joy, and everything in between. She left him that day knowing it would likely be the last time she spoke with him, and she carried his calm presence like a warm memory. As she returned home, Adrian passed away peacefully not long after, in the soft light of dawn. While the world outside whispered into a new day, the historian received the news from one of his neighbors, and she sat quietly for a long time thinking about the man whose mistake had changed the lives of thousands across the land. News traveled slowly, but it reached the old commander, who was living out his own final years. When he heard of Adrian's passing, he placed his hand over his heart and whispered a silent thank you. He knew that without Adrian, none of his men would have survived, not him, not his friends, not the civilians who later rebuilt their lives. He knew that the world was forever connected to that single moment in the communications bunker, and he felt an unspoken bond with the man he never met but who had saved him decades earlier. The historian later published her final book called The Echoes of Imperfection. It explored the idea that human flaws often shape the world more than human Strengths that small, unplanned decisions can ripple across time, creating waves no one anticipates. She wrote about Adrian without revealing his full identity, respecting his desire for quiet. She described him as the anonymous operator, the man in the bunker, the one whose mistake guided an entire battalion to safety. She described the mountain pass, the terror, and the silence, the dawn that rose behind them, and the hidden truth that no one fully understood. She wrote that the story was a reminder to all generations that life is not a straight line, that destiny curves in mysterious ways, and that sometimes the most unbelievable miracle is born from the most ordinary human error. Her book became a quiet but powerful influence. Teachers used it to teach compassion. Philosophers used it to illustrate the unpredictable nature of existence. Leaders used it to remind themselves to stay humble, and individuals from all walks of life found comfort in the idea that perfection is not required to shape the world, that even mistakes can carry meaning, that every human moment matters in ways we cannot foresee. In the town the battalion once saved, a memorial stone was placed in the center of the rebuilt square. It was not grand nor elaborate, just a smooth stone with a simple carved message that read, "To the unknown choices that saved us." The people of the town knew their survival had come from a moment lost in the fog of war, a moment they would never fully understand, but they honored it anyway with gratitude and reverence. Soldiers from the surviving battalion sometimes visited the town in their old age, walking slowly through the streets that existed because of that miraculous turn of events. Some brought their grandchildren, pointing at the mountains and telling them that history had been rewritten there by a man who never sought praise, by a mistake that no one meant to make, by a moment that should have brought destruction but instead brought life. One soldier, who had been only 19 at the time of the event, now an elderly man with silver hair and unsteady steps, placed his hand on the memorial stone and whispered, "I am here because of you, whoever you were. Thank you." His voice trembled with emotion as memories flooded back: the narrow path, the uncertainty, the expectation of death, and the sudden shocking realization that they had slipped through the enemy lines untouched. He remembered looking up at the sunrise, thinking it might be the last he would ever see, but instead it became the sunrise of his second life. As decades passed, the legend of the mistake that saved thousands continued to grow, but it did not grow as a heroic myth. Instead, it grew as a profound reflection on the nature of humanity. Teachers shared it, parents passed it to their children, storytellers wove it into their tales, and travelers carried it from place to place. The story found its way into quiet conversations late at night, when people reflected on their own lives, their own mistakes, their own unexpected blessings. And through these conversations, Adrian's presence lingered in the world, not as a celebrated hero, not as a figure carved in stone, but as a gentle reminder that every life carries the power to shape others, even in ways no one intends or understands. In the final pages of the historian's book, she wrote that Adrian left no monument, yet his legacy stands taller than stone. He left no medal, yet his actions shine brighter than gold. He left no proclamation, yet his story whispers softly across the world, teaching that perfection is not the source of all miracles, that sometimes mistakes shape the future in ways more compassionate, more unexpected, and more beautiful than any human plan could ever achieve. And so the story lives on, drifting through time like a quiet echo, reminding everyone who hears it that even the smallest moment, even the most accidental choice, even the most unbelievable mistake can save thousands and change the world forever.